The case of Mrs. Dina Best outlines behaviours of discrimination while working as a registered paramedic in London. The London Health and Care Professionals Tribunal Service found her behaviour to be gross professional misconduct, impairing her fitness to practice. It was alleged that Mrs. Best made culturally insensitive comments relating to the race and religion of two colleagues. Mrs. Best was reported to senior staff, resulting in an investigation and consequently a 9-month suspension of her registration. In Australia, paramedicine became a registered health professional under the Health Practitioner Regulation National Law Act in 2018. Under this Act, paramedics are governed by the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency, APRA, within the Paramedicine Board of Australia, which involves complying with reporting mechanisms regarding professional conduct. These reporting mechanisms aim to ensure public safety and maintain professional standards. The national law obliges health professionals to notify APRA if a professional believes a colleague has behaved in a way that constitutes noticeable conduct. A national law identifies 4 definitions constituting noticeable conduct. Mrs. Best's comments satisfy the last definition. APRA states that a clear breach of code of conduct that places the public at risk of harm is enough to satisfy a significant departure from accepted professional standards and thus noticeable conduct. It can be argued that any breach of code of conduct, which is an organization-specific process aiming to maintain patient safety, which places a patient at inherent risk of harm. Therefore, Mrs. Best's comments, which breach sections 3.7, Cultural Safety and Sensitive Practice, section 4.2, Respect for Colleagues and Other Practitioners, and section 8, Professional Behavior, placed her patients at risk of harm. Furthermore, Mrs. Best's comments also demonstrate workplace harassment breaching section 4.4 regarding teamwork, where Mrs. Best was expected to avoid and eliminate behaviors of bullying and harassment in the workplace. These specific behaviors particularly place Mrs. Best's patients at obvious risk of harm, especially those of racial and ethnic minorities. Despite Mrs. Best's colleagues stating that her patient care was not impaired, her comments undeniably placed her patients at obvious risk of harm amounting to notifiable conduct. Mrs. Best's actions also breached the Anti-Discrimination Act of 1991, which prohibits discrimination on race or religious beliefs and discrimination within the workplace. Following a mandatory notification of Mrs. Best's behavior, APRA would conduct an initial investigation. An investigator would gather evidence and provide a written report to APRA outlining findings and recommendations about any action to be taken in relation to the health practitioner. Similar to the HCPTS, evidence would depend on interviews of Mrs. Best and her colleagues as informed by Qantas Airways vs. Gamma, where His Honour did not find that racial discrimination could be proved by the absence of satisfactory denial, and the standard of proof remains the same, that is, the proof of balance of probabilities. If APRA perceives Mrs. Best's practice as unsatisfactory, they refer their report to the National Board, who can make any of the following decisions based on the allegations, facts, and evidence. If the board believes there is a serious risk to the public health and safety, they can take immediate action. However, as Mrs. Best's notification does not satisfy this criteria, she would be referred to either a performance and professional standards panel or a tribunal panel instead. Mrs. Best's behavior would most likely constitute professional misconduct as opposed to unsatisfactory professional performance or unprofessional conduct and be referred to a tribunal panel. Professional misconduct does not fall within the above statutory definition of misconduct. As demonstrated in Reliance v. General Medical Council, any behavior that causes the public to consider the reputation and standing of a profession unfavorably also constitutes as professional misconduct. If a professional is found to have committed professional misconduct, the tribunal can take disciplinary action. This is not only enforced in the national law, but in the Ambulance Service Act of 1991. Disciplinary action is not enforced to punish a practitioner, but instead to maintain proper ethical and professional standards for the protection of the public and the profession itself. In cases of professional misconduct, disciplinary action can be imposed, which includes reprimand, a fine, suspension, or cancellation of registration. As APRA states, a practitioner's registration is suspended when the tribunal believes a practitioner presents a risk to the public and that suspension is an appropriate way to address the risk until the matter has been resolved. As stated before, Mrs. Best's behavior poses a risk to the public. This is enforced by Mrs. Best's lack of insight into the seriousness of the allegation, referring to her comments as jovial or banter. Suspension is appropriate when a practitioner's behavior has fallen below professional standards but do not indicate that they lack the qualities of a paramedic. Mrs. Best has maintained an unembellished career and was respected by her colleagues. Therefore, similar to the case of Medical Board of Australia vs. Dr. Christopher Kwan Chan Lee, where Dr. Lee made offensive posts on social media, a suspension is appropriate where the tribunal is satisfied that upon completion of the period of suspension, the practitioner will be fit to resume practice. In addition to a suspension, like Dr. Lee, Mrs. Best could benefit from education on ethical behavior, anti-discrimination policies, and communication principles. If Mrs. Best were a practicing paramedic in Queensland, her behavior would have prompted a mandatory reporting to APRA as obligated. Mrs. Best breached the Paramedic Code of Conduct and consequently placed patients, particularly those of ethnic backgrounds, at risk. Mrs. Best would have been investigated and found guilty of professional misconduct, and her registration would have been suspended. This process exists to protect the public, maintain public trust in health professionals, and uphold the high standard of professionalism within the body of registered health professionals.